tonight. I see some familiar faces, some new faces, but what I feel in this room is really good energy tonight. So I love that. Let me get my presentation pulled up here. And I will say that I had a surgery early in March and ended up last week just not feeling well. And it turned out I had a very bad infection. And so I just got out of the hospital Sunday night. So bear with me if I'm not my normal energetic self, but I still wanted to be here with you tonight. And the other thing, I have a little bit of good news. I also found out today that I got tenure. So on a happier note. So no, tenure. Yes.
Non-academics here.
Yes, sorry. That means
Associate professor.
that means that I'm at a Missouri Public University, so now I officially have some protections to say what I need to say. But anyway, it's great to be here with you tonight. And when Maureen asked me to come, she suggested maybe focusing on the midterms and thinking a little bit about what that means for us here in Missouri, in District 2, and nationally. And so that's what I'm going to talk about tonight. And then leave lots of time for Q&A because there are endless things to talk about. All right, so making sure I thought we'd start out by talking about the House. And as probably everyone in this room knows, currently the Republicans hold a narrow majority, so the Democrats need to net 3 seats. Historically, the president's party usually doesn't do great in midterms, so that's the first part of good news. And the Democrats have been overperforming the 2024 results, so outperforming what Vice President Harris did. We have high gas prices, a low presidential approval rating, under 40% now, which also bodes well for the party that's out of power. And prediction markets, just another data point. I have some issues with these prediction markets, and I think it's pretty clear that folks in the Trump administration are using those to get rich right now. But they are just another data point, and those are putting the Democrats at 80 to 90% likelihood to win the House. And then, of course, we have redistricting, which is this crazy, how many times can we say unprecedented situation that we have going on right now. And so, and we can talk more about it in Q&A. So I thought I'd put this slide up here. Hopefully you can kind of see it. Basically, this is all the midterm election years going back to 2000. And it's how many incumbents were defeated. So you want a big red line there and a small blue line. And it shows you that in 2006, which is the closest data points we have right now to presidential approval, a quagmire in the Middle East, inflation, all these things. And you can see that it was only Republicans that were defeated in that midterm election when it came to incumbents. Obama famously said there's a shellacking in 2010, and he wasn't wrong. And so this kind of gives you an idea of what the midterms sort of look like for incumbents generally. Now, this year, one of the issues we have is gerrymandering. We have so much gerrymandering and self-sorting. We tend to move around people who are kind of like-minded, and particularly liberals tend to be more concentrated in the urban and suburban areas. And so in 2024, 84% of the House seats were decided by 10 or more points. So they're very solidly Republican or very solidly Democratic. And only 37 seats out of 435 were decided by 5 or fewer points. So competitive House races are not very common anymore. And then all of this stuff, the nicest word I can use to describe it, we're doing with redistricting now is just going to make that worse. The average margin of victory in 2024 for a House seat was 27 points. So what that means is the primary is the real race. So if you live in District 1, which you all probably don't, but I do, the primary is the race there, right? Bell and Bush. But there are also 14 Democratic-held House districts up for election in 2026 that Trump won in 2024. So 14 Democrats in the House, but Trump won that district. So those are a little tighter. And then 13 where the Republicans hold it, but Harris won in 2024. Another dynamic that is unique this year is it's the second highest turnover we've seen in Congress in a century. 1992 was the only other point that was this high. And so 20 Democrats and 35 Republicans are choosing not to seek re-election. What you were probably as interested in is the national landscape, is what's happening right here. So as you probably know, Ann Wagner was elected in 2012 and has won re-election every cycle since then. This district, Cook Political Report lists as a solidly Republican, so Republican +4 district. But one thing that this district really has going for it, and probably one reason that the national Democrats are looking at this as a district in play, as they call it, is that this district, out of all the Missouri districts, has higher income and education. And that is the type of district that we have seen in the Trump era increasingly go for Democrats. This, I know, is probably kind of hard to read, but I just wanted to give a snapshot of what's happened in the last several races. So you can see 2018, Court Van Ostren was a strong candidate, got about 47% to Wagner's 51%. Jill Shoup, another strong candidate, got about 45% to Ann Wagner's. And then we had redistricting. And so, as you know, I used to be in District 2. I live in Brentwood. I didn't move. They drew me out of that district, right? And then they drew in folks in Franklin County and Jefferson County to make it more Republican. And so there was a shift in 2022 where Ann Wagner picked up about 3 percentage points higher than she had done prior to that redistricting, but those are not insurmountable numbers. So to flip this seat, Democrats need kind of a wave election. And we seem to have the variables in place for a wave election, like we saw in 2018, 2010, 2006. You also need a strong candidate. We know that Ann Wagner is not present in the district, period. That she will not debate her opponents. None of those opponents that I showed in the last slide would she debate. But you need a candidate who can go out and can be charismatic. And, you know, when I hear what you're doing with the school lunch funding and all that, that's the sort of thing that's important. And we're going to talk a little bit about independent voters. They want to see action, and they want to see things being put into place, not partisan bickering. They want to see people saying, let's come together, identify a problem in our community, and solve it together. And so I think that kind of action, not only is it beneficial, obviously, to the community and important work, but it is the kind of thing that motivates folks to turn out, that makes them feel a little less jaded about politics, feel like things can actually be solved. You want to see that continued suburban shift away from Republicans, which we have been seeing. And Ann Wagner's margin needs to stay in those low 50%, like 50, 51, lower than that. And so one big thing is St. Louis County. She won St. Louis County in the last cycle. And if the Democrat doesn't win the St. Louis County part of District 2, then there's not a chance. So what the work you're doing is really important there. So we have several candidates, but really it's kind of if I were going to say it, kind of the two candidates, Fred Wellman and Joan Vondras. And I am interested in the Q&A for those of you who are in the district who have been kind of hearing more from these candidates, what your feelings are. But I think what most Democrats are interested in the Trump era is who is electable in the general election. And so that's kind of what I'm going to think about and focus about in this talk. Just to give you a snapshot of where these candidates stand as far as fundraising, you can see that Ann Wagner has raised almost $3 million. That when it comes to the Democrats, that Fred Wellman has by far raised the most, almost $1 million. And that Joan Vondras was not listed there in this campaign finance report, but most of hers comes from a loan she made herself to the campaign of $260,000. So largely self-funded at this point. So if any of these candidates are going to beat Ann Wagner, they're going to need a much bigger war chest than this. And that's the hope, since the National Party has identified this as a district to watch, that maybe they'll get involved. But there's a pretty short time horizon from that August primary to the November election that this person really needs to get name recognition and be out in the community. And the other issue, like we've talked about for the House, is redistricting. So obviously everyone knows what happened with Virginia last night, and we know there's continued lawsuits, just like there is in Missouri. But overall, this is sort of where it stands, that the Democrats, I think it's so interesting that, the president and his administration, I suppose they thought Democrats would just take this line down, that they could go to Texas and say, hey, redraw all these seats. And Indiana, which Indiana kind of told them to kiss off. Of course, Missouri, we capitulated. But, that he could go to all these states and that the Democrats wouldn't respond. Now, granted, in general, Democrats have been in favor of nonpartisan commissions. We even passed that with the Clean Missouri Act here until the state legislature decided to overturn that. But, California and Virginia went to their voters and said, this is what's happening. Basically, will you give us a dispensation to stay competitive in this election? And they did. So I think that was a bit of a rude awakening. Now, what remains to be seen, other than like Missouri's lawsuit and Virginia's lawsuit, is what Florida is going to do. And so that could be a tipping point if Florida, they did call a special session to see if they're going to change their seats. And in Missouri, this is what the change would predominantly look like. It's really focused on Kansas City, the 5th district. Emmanuel Cleaver has been the representative there for quite some time. And what this would do is take that 5th district and split it up. So you see all those blue voters would be split. And if you see that sliver of the 4th district that goes up the side there, and so that is one of the lawsuits saying that these are not compact contiguous districts, which is a requirement in Missouri law. But I think, to me, what is really problematic about this whole episode that we're having with redistricting, it's like an arms race, right? We're all trying to outdo the next. It's making it so, particularly in urban areas, is what, a lot of these redistricting are going after, and breaking up. So we call this cracking instead of packing, cracking open those districts. And so people who live in Kansas City wouldn't have a voice, a consolidated voice to represent them. And this predominantly disenfranchises voters of color, which is no surprise. And so you can see how the margins would change. It would go from the 5th district being a 23-point Democratic district and sort of spread it there. Now, one possibility, and definitely Texas, this is a real possibility. If this happens in Missouri, it's a possibility, is they're doing this data based on the 2024 election. But that Trump coalition from the 2024 election is fracturing. Latino voters, young voters, they're not getting what they were promised. And so this could, in some districts, backfire. These are projections of how they're going to work. But if you make the margins more and more narrow, that gives Democrats a fighting chance in some of these districts. And that is what some of the incumbent Republicans are nervous about. And so SLU Poll did some polling in February with YouGov and asked Missouri voters, do you support this new map or not? And so you can see overall, 41% support and 44% oppose. Now it's a 3-point margin of error, so it's basically a toss-up right now. But you can definitely see that only 68% of Republicans in Missouri are saying that they support this. And that's before really a campaign has taken place. And so I think the anti-campaign will be well funded and will be very well able to articulate their message. So we will keep an eye on what happens in this, but all the documentation is there that the signatures are enough. Our Secretary of State is just dragging his feet on certifying those. He has until August to certify the signatures, so we will have to wait on that. And then the Senate. So every 2 years, the entire House of Representatives is up for election. So we could vote out the entire House every 2 years if we wanted. Now, the incumbency re-election rate is like 95%. We don't do that, but we could. And then in the Senate, They have 6-year terms. So every 2 years, a third of the Senate is up for election. And so the map is actually favorable to Republicans this cycle. You can see that there are 21 races that are Republican-held seats and 13 that are Democrat-held seats. Missouri, we don't have a senator up for election this cycle. So the Democrats would need to flip 4 seats to take over the Senate. That tie-breaking vote is J.D. Vance. So they need 51, where the Republicans only need 50. But, you know, earlier on, if you asked a year ago, looking at this map, people would have told you, no, Democrats aren't going to get that. They'll probably take the House, but not the Senate. But it is increasingly looking better in the Senate. So right now, every Democrat in the Senate is from a state that Biden won in 2020. But if you see here, these Michigan, Georgia, North Carolina, Ohio, Alaska, and Maine, basically the Democrats need to flip 4 of those. And not only is the overall environment with dissatisfaction with, you know, foreign entanglements, inflation, gas prices, all of these things, folks are souring on the Trump administration. But in recent polling for the Senate, because it's statewide, is a little better than polling for the House, especially this far out. And Democrats appear to be tied or ahead in Maine. In North Carolina, they have clear leads. And then in Ohio and Alaska, which you would not think are states that Democrats could flip, but they have really strong candidates there. And so they're actually polling pretty well there. So prediction markets have it basically a toss-up, which is as good as the Democrats could hope for at this point. So overall, the Democrats are leading by about 5 to 6 points on the generic congressional ballot, like would you vote for a Democrat or Republican. That's a sizable lead, but smaller than it was in 2006 and 2018. But not all voters turn out in midterm elections. I wish we had like an 80% voter turnout rate, but we have like a 40% voter turnout rate in midterm elections. And so that means it's the most energized voters who come out. And right now, Democrats have the edge on motivated voters. Also, Trump is not on the ballot. And I think that this is unfortunate, but voters with lower levels of education and lower levels of income turn out to vote at lower rates. I wish that weren't the case. But right now, that is a lot of the Trump base. And then add in the fact that he's not actually on the ballot, that those things give Democrats an edge there as far as the energy and likelihood of voter turnout. And then, as I'm sure you're all aware, that in the special elections and other elections we've had since 2025, Democrats are outperforming what Harris did in 2024 by an average of about 13 points. So that makes, you know, if you look at the Ann Wagner's margins, if Democrats could capitalize on that, that's how you take those candidates down and flip those seats. So overall, you know, the economy, right? As Bill Clinton would say, it's the economy, stupid. That is the number one issue for most voters. Can I afford my medicine? Can I afford my health care? Can I put gas in my tank? And then presidential approval. Midterms are usually a referendum on the president, and his approval is tanking. War and foreign policy. So how is this going to go? You know, every week we have a new extension, a new deadline, a new objective and reason that we're engaged in this. And then we get the random comments about maybe I'll go take Cuba next, right? So it's really unpredictable about what's going to happen between now and November, but I don't see a scenario in which the foreign policy goes very well for the Republicans. And those retirements means they don't have incumbents running, makes it a little more challenging. And candidate quality, that's where the Senate race is looking better for Democrats because they've been able to recruit really good candidates. So I think that what is in Democrats' power, whether it's in District 2 or across the country, is to try to energize voters, and not just the base, but also appealing to independent voters. That's who's going to decide this election. And making inroads in rural areas and with working class voters. Those folks, I grew up in Jefferson County. My dad was UAW. we were, Union Democrats, as were all the folks that we knew who lived around us, who worked at Chrysler with my dad. And now those folks are Trump voters. But I think they're getting disenfranchised because they were sold one thing and they're being given something else. And so I think with the right messaging and outreach, there's an opportunity to make some changes there. And so I thought this was interesting. We're going to talk about independent voters a bit. And this is the biggest voting bloc right now. So if you see that dotted line, you have about 27% who identify as Republicans, about 27% who identify as Democrats, but 45% identify as independents. Now, most of these folks lean Democratic or lean Republican, but they are not identifying with the party. And this is if you include leaning. So you say, do you tend to lean? So this is just independents. But when you say, do you tend to lean towards Democrats or Republicans? There is a 5-point advantage for Democrats there. And here, this is about your ideology. So do you consider yourself liberal, conservative, or moderate? And yes, not surprisingly, Republicans overwhelmingly conservative, Democrats overwhelmingly liberal. And then if you look at independents, that top line is moderate, and then liberal and conservative. So when we're thinking about going after independent voters in the general election, you have to think about some kind of moderation. Another thing is age. Younger voters, again, I wish this weren't true. They don't turn out to vote as at high of rates as older voters. But if you can get them engaged when they're young, they stay engaged. And so to have a District 2 or a Chesterfield or a Missouri that doesn't just do well this cycle, but continues, you've got to engage the younger voters. And younger voters are the most likely to say, I'm independent. And then millennials. So basically, people who are younger than me or my age identify as independent, and people who are older than me identify as partisan. So this is an important block. They tend to, the Independent Center did some polling in the fall, and basically they feel tired of what they feel like are extremes. Whether they think it's woke or authoritarianism or, ICE agents on the street. They don't want to have to think about politics every day and feel this divisiveness. They identify themselves as caring about policy and getting things done over party. And when they're looking at candidates, they're listening to the tone and they want to hear pragmatism, how you're going to get things done. Identify the problem. How can you solve it? What are you going to do for me? And so those, real issues of inflation, housing costs, wages, healthcare, and, not just these abstract ideas. Like we can probably all agree that there are threats to democracy and this is important. But when we're trying to communicate with voters who are sort of less engaged or less partisan, talking about what impacts them day to day is really important. And they're not uniformly centrist. They often have kind of mixed views, like maybe fiscally moderate or conservative, but more socially liberal or moderate. So kind of mixed views that they don't feel like they fit in any one party. And so when candidates and when we are talking to voters and trying to think about how to communicate with them, it doesn't help to badmouth one party. And you want to talk about problem solving over doctrine, what are credible solutions, and acknowledge like where some of their frustration comes from, why they might not think the Republicans are doing things right or the Democrats are, or the system is broken. Now, obviously we know elections aren't rigged and that, they're run well and things like that. But the frustration with the system, that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, that our tax policies under the big beautiful bill and other things, cuts to Medicaid, cuts to food stamps, that these are real issues. And so I think to make folks feel heard and to sincerely try to understand their frustrations. And so I'm just going to very quickly, these are from the Independent Center. So what I'm going to focus on here, we know Democrats are going to be on one side, Republicans are going to be on the other. And so I'm going to try to just look at this, if my pointer works, maybe not, independent column. And so if we look here, the number one issue for independents, job and the economy, next healthcare, affordability. So those are their type issues. And then here, so that was national. When we ask about what are your top issues for your local officials, affordability, jobs, and then taxes and government spending comes up when you ask about local. And of course, we know what Missouri is doing with taxes. And so I think how we communicate and message about the income tax is going to be really important too. Thank you. And then they ask, what do you think about the Republican Party? Favorable to unfavorable, and Democratic Party. And you can see that somewhat favorable and very unfavorable are the biggest categories for how they think about Republicans. Somewhat favorable, very unfavorable, and somewhat unfavorable for Democrats too. So they don't think very well of either party. And who can blame them sometimes, right? And so then when asked, how do you feel about, is the Republican Party or Democratic Party too extreme in their positions? Most Americans say yes. They understand that there's middle ground and sometimes we need to compromise. Do they govern in an honest and ethical way? Democratic Party has a slight edge, but just within the margin of error. And do they respect democratic institutions? This is where the Democratic Party pulls ahead. So overall, Americans say that Trump is focusing too much on foreign affairs and not enough on domestic affairs. And again, you can see with independents, that's 76% of independents. You know, when I look at this polling, again, I tend to kind of ignore what Democrats and Republicans say because we know they're dug in on both sides, and look at the independents. And overall, when it comes to economic issues, healthcare is the thing that people are most concerned about. As somebody who, unfortunately, I've had a number of surgeries over the last 2 years, I have system health insurance. I have good health insurance. I still probably paid about $7,000 out of pocket last year. That would bankrupt a lot of people, right? Medical bankruptcy is a real thing. And so the cost of healthcare is the biggest concern when it comes to those costs. And again, different polling, same outcome, healthcare, and then food and groceries. Just meeting your day-to-day needs. Those are the pressures that folks are feeling. And when they're asked, will the cost of healthcare, and I'm focusing on healthcare not only because it's the number one thing people are concerned about, but because I'm going to show you in a slide in a second that voters have more trust in Democrats than Republicans when it comes to healthcare. And we saw in the 2018 midterms, that was a big deal. And now, even though Republicans were fairly strategic about making some of the benefits of the big, beautiful bill, like no tax on tips, kick in now, but the cuts to Medicaid and SNAP kick in after the election. And so people might not be aware of how this is going to affect them until after they cast their vote. So it's important to let folks know that. And so when they say, will the cost of healthcare impact your midterm vote? Overall, voters say it will have a major impact, 44% of voters, including 45% of independents. So this is an important talking point for candidates as well. And then when you ask, who do you trust on these healthcare issues? Democrats come out ahead of Republicans on across the board. And then they ask just independents, who do you trust more? And again, Democrats by like double and triple have more trust when it comes to healthcare. And you know, this is what the last government shutdown was about, cutting the Affordable Act subsidies. And so people are feeling this right now. I know my beautician, the person who does my hair, she's self-employed and she gets the insurance for herself, her husband, and her child, and her monthly premium has doubled. So people are already feeling this. We're seeing lots of people come off the rolls because they can't afford their premiums anymore. So I won't belabor this healthcare anymore, but I think it's an important issue and one where the Democrats have an edge. This is interesting too. When we ask people, how do you feel about your party? So this is about asking about your own party. You're a Democrat. How do you feel about Democrats? You're a Republican. How do you feel about Republicans? Democrats are frustrated. They're angry at their own party. And hopeful and proud have declined. And so a lot of the polling we see that is a little more positive about Republicans, a little more negative about Democrats, is largely because Democrats are frustrated with their own party. Things aren't going how they want. Maybe they want to see people stand up to Trump more. Maybe they just want to see more action, different candidates. And so there's frustration within the party as well as outside the party. And when they asked why, Democrats or folks who lean Democrat, why are you frustrated with Democrats? The number one reason is you're not fighting hard enough against Donald Trump. And to really be able to have that fight, you've got to take control of at least the House. Then you can have hearings, you can bring things to attention, you can stop his legislative agenda, although frankly, outside of the big, beautiful bill, he hasn't really accomplished much legislatively. But his executive actions are the most since FDR. But anyway, this is what folks are frustrated with. And so what do Democratic voters want from their candidates? They want, so which comes closest to your view? The Democratic Party needs to move further to the left and energize the base. About 22% of Democratic voters say that's what needs to happen. The largest part, the red line, says the Democratic parties need to move towards the center and win over more voters. And I suspect that that's the case in District 2. If you're trying to win over voters in Jefferson County, Franklin County, even here in Chesterfield, Eureka, you need someone who can speak to their concerns, that they don't feel like is extreme, and that can communicate those messages. And so they put these, I think it was about 2,500 Democratic voters that they sampled into these categories of the woke fringe, which is kind of the furthest left proportion, which they found was only 11% of Democratic voters. And so while a lot of us probably would like to see some bigger, more progressive change, when we look at the electorate as a whole, to make progress, we sort of have to moderate a little. Okay, there's a lot more stuff we talk about, but it's 8 o'clock, and so I'm gonna pause there and take some Q&A. We can talk about whatever you would like, and I will do my best to respond.
I'm gonna walk around with the microphone so that the people watching Facebook can hear. So hold on just a second. I'll try not to put. Okay, who wants to go first?
Actually, I'm not controlling that. The slides, let's see, she asked if we could have the slides back up. There we go.
Oh, that one that is, I think it's interesting, that last one I think you showed. Yeah, I think that's an interesting one for me.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, let me go to that here.
Okay, so I'm curious on the slide where it asks that I feel like our own party.
Yeah.
Does that take into account how membership of each party or how affiliation with each party has changed over time? Because I mean, just speaking for people I know personally, 10 years ago they stopped calling themselves Republicans and just called themselves conservatives. So I'm just curious if that takes that into account.
Yeah, that's fair. This is people who self-identify, but they also lumped in people who lean Democratic or lean Republican. So it would probably still encapsulate those people. That's like my father-in-law. He used to be a Republican lobbyist. And, you know, in 2016, he said, I can't vote for Clinton. I can't vote for Trump. So he wrote in. And then after January 6th, he said, if this is my party, I'm no longer a Republican. So I think he would identify as that lean Republican, which would be counted here.
So you often hear that, you know, when you have votes against and waiting for more Democrats, that's going to also affect statewide slate with more Democratic candidates. And we have a supermajority in Missouri. We can't do anything fast. Can you comment on the impact or any insights into the state level race?
Yeah. You know, it is so interesting to me that when we look at ballot initiatives, there's a reason that our state legislature is attacking them and trying to make it literally impossible to do anything through them. because voters in Missouri have since 2018 voted to legalize medicinal and recreational marijuana, to raise the minimum wage, to have paid sick leave, to expand Medicaid, to do all these things our state legislature does not want to do. And actually, after the 2018 election, my colleague and I went to the state legislature. We met with representatives and we showed them the data from their district. And we said, your district voted yes on marijuana, yes on minimum wage, yes on Clean Missouri, whatever the issues. And you oppose all these. And they voted for you at the same time. Can you help us understand this? And I will say there was one gentleman from Jefferson County, I will not say his name, but I appreciated his candor. He said, oh, well, voters in my district only care about 3 things. I said, what are those? And he said, as long as I say the right thing on those, I'm okay. It doesn't matter what I say about anything else. I said, tell me about that. What are those? He said, guns, babies, and it was like almost a Rick Perry moment. He couldn't think of a third. So he said, I guess babies with guns. And he said, as long as basically I am anti-abortion and pro-gun rights, nothing else matters. And so I think that, that disconnect is really interesting. And what I would like to see better messaging on is trying to tell voters that you vote for these things like paid sick leave, and your state legislature wiped them out and got rid of them. And, so I don't know how we can better communicate that message and help highlight that disconnect. But I think right now, everything is so partisan. And even, folks who get government benefits, who, benefit from social welfare programs, but it's your team red or team blue, and nothing else matters. So we've got to crack through that if we're going to make changes in the state legislature. But I do think that energizing, left-leaning voters and getting them out is one good chance that we have.
I have several questions.
Yes, ma'am.
The fact that you actually went and talked to the legislators and showed them the data, can you say a little bit more? I don't know if you're a psychologist, but can you say a little bit more about their, and maybe that's taking a leap, but how do they themselves personally reconcile that, hey, while they care about these three things when I say them, I'm still there to represent them, not ignoring it. So what is sort of their mindset when they're, pushing these, they're voting against what their voters want?
Yeah, and we actually went sort of representing this Scholar Strategy Network. It's like a nonpartisan nonprofit where it helps academics make our research understandable to policymakers and things like that. So we were offering are there things you want us to research? Here's some data we can provide. So there were a couple Republican women, not men, who said, oh, I'm interested, they want to implement closed primaries. So can you give me data on open versus closed? So some of them actually had some questions, but I think on the whole, the idea was, well, I make my positions known and the voters vote for me. And so I'm going to follow through with those positions. That was my takeaway. And until the voters hold them accountable, why would they not do that?
Okay, so I know a lot of your data says less educated. I've seen that other places, less educated voters are lower income to vote for Trump, at least that are already leaning conservative.
And particularly white, lower income and lower educated voters.
But personally, I have friends that are PhDs and doctors, and this is just anecdotally, but you also see this when Ann Wagner and just other people they are voting that have higher income, higher education, they're still voting for Trump. So
Sure.
Can you talk about a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes people vote in their own economic self-interest, right? Regardless. So if you are a higher income earner, the big beautiful bill probably was good for you. If you are invested in the stock market, that is one of the only metrics that Trump actually responds to, is trying to keep the stock market high. And so even when we talk about the income tax in Missouri, people say, why the heck, are we trying to get this passed when it will undermine so much? Well, if your donors and your big money voters support this because it benefits them, because the income tax is progressive and sales tax is regressive. That's going to fall on the backs of poorer people. And so, you know, it's not, of course, 100%, but we have seen in the Trump era since 2016, pretty much the biggest dividing factor, particularly among white voters, is education. More than income is education. And I think part of that is not just because you have higher level education doesn't mean you're more intelligent, but I think it often means you're exposed to more diverse ideas and people, and maybe think a little differently about those things.
How do we break through to people who only watch Fox News?
Oh man. Or that are in their social media bubble, as we all are to a certain extent. I will say, after the 2016 election, over like our winter break, I read Hillbilly Elegy. I read Strangers in Their Own Land. I read Politics of Resentment. All these books that really try to explore not only kind of the white working class voter that was foundational to Trump's coalition and the folks I grew up with, but also voters who oftentimes do vote against their own self-interest. So of those, I would really recommend Strangers in Their Own Land. That was a social scientist from Berkeley, went and embedded herself in Louisiana for years, trying to understand folks are reliant on this water and these natural resources for their living. They care about this, but they're voting against protections. And like, why is that happening? And the narrative that she came away with, and she went back to the folks and asked them, and they said, yes, this is it, was, here I am, I've been doing all the right things. I got married. I'm a Christian. I have a job. I did the things I'm supposed to do. I'm straight. I'm, you know, these things that are, when I was growing up, were seen as good. And now I feel like I am no longer seen as good, that I'm being left behind. And not only that, you know, that people who aren't Christian are thought well of, or people who aren't straight are thought well of. And so that means that I'm not kind of elevated in a way that I felt elevated before. And not only that, but then there was this president named Obama, and he's letting people cut in line. And those people are women, those people are black, those people, and they're getting, even the women would say, well, why is a woman getting a job my husband should have had? Right? And so, and we can laugh and snicker, and trust me, I roll my eyes about it sometimes, but then I think we have to stop and think. Folks are being economically left behind, even if some of the social stuff might not align with our values, but they feel like they're losing their footing or their place.
That's not my question.
Okay.
My question is how Fox News is a propaganda channel.
I agree.
How do we get this voting bloc to receive news from other sources so that they really know what truly is going on?
I don't think you can. I mean, to a certain extent. But I think what you can do is engage people in conversation. So I guess that's why I went to the idea of trying to understand where folks are coming from. And that's how Fox News is appealing to them. Donald Trump in 2024, these were not truthful messages, but they were easy to understand messages. Crime's high in your neighborhood, immigrants. You can't find a house, immigrants are taking the houses. You can't find a job, immigrants are taking your jobs. Now, none of that's true, but it is a simple answer. It puts blame on someone else. And I'm not saying that's the right messaging, but I'm saying it's effective. And so then how do you unprogram that? And I think it also has to be clear messaging and straightforward. I don't think you're going to get people to turn off Fox News or stop following what they follow on social media. I do gently debunk things when I see inaccurate posts on social media, but I don't have a solution for that. And in the same way, we could argue we're not going to turn off, you know, I'm a PBS NewsHour girl or New York Times or whatever. You know, we all have our sources, but what I try to encourage people is like, just add one thing to your media diet. So maybe you can find a commentator. My old boss tried to say that Fox News and NPR were the same. And I said, Bill, have you ever listened to NPR? And he said, no. I said, do me a favor. This week when you're driving to work, just turn it on and see if it's the same. And he came back and he giggled. I said, was it boring? He said, yeah. I'm like, exactly. It's not incendiary. It's boring. So maybe, you know, if you have a friend or a family member, you could encourage them, like, just for a week, try listening to this source and see how that feels to you.
I'm going to switch topics a little bit.
Sure.
What is an extreme ideological topic for Democrats? You said something about Democrats being extreme.
And Republicans.
Ideology.
Yeah.
But I want to know what's considered extreme.
So that is, I think that's a fair question. They didn't list topics, but it is just the perception among voters that both parties are too extreme. So I think it's not even necessarily for Democrats' policy positions. I think it's the way that we talk about them. It's obviously apparent that Republicans have picked up on this issue of like trans rights, gender affirming care, however you want to think about it. And I will give kudos to my colleague, Mark Maxwell at Channel 5. I have seen him in the last couple of months sit down with Republican candidates and say, you're putting this front and center in your campaign. Do you know of any, you know, transgender girls in your district that are playing sports? Well, no. Then why is this what you're talking about? Well, I mean, the voters care about it. They're dog whistles. That's why they put that language in this abortion ballot initiative too. And so while I wouldn't consider that extreme ideology, what will happen is, you know, they try to paint it as we're not being, suddenly people care about women's sports, right? Allegedly. But trying to paint it as like, this is unfair to our daughters and stoking that fire. And so I think that, again, it's not necessarily the issues. I mean, I think most of us would say parents should be able to work with their doctors and their children and make their own medical decisions, but it's how we frame it. I think in some of these abortion initiatives, like in Oklahoma and in Missouri, they did a really good job, liberals did a really good job of framing it as small government, keeping, you know, decisions between your doctor, freedom. So I think a lot of it is just about how we talk about it, less about the policies. You're welcome.
Maybe I'm a little bit silly here, but I want to hear the rest of Fox News. Aren't there a number of pretty prominent folks who have left Fox News, one particularly
to join the cabinet? I know. Yes. Yes.
Am I wrong?
No.
Carlson is one of them. I mean, maybe you should have T-shirts that say Tucker Carlson is my hero.
I don't know. No, but I hear what you're saying. It is important to be able to, and you know, there have been Democratic office holders who I kind of liked. I thought they were fiery or good, and then I found out they did something really abhorrent. And it's important that we acknowledge that and say, like, okay, I thought this person was some person. They've done something wrong. That is not okay. They need to go away. And I do appreciate that there are some people that have been sort of cutting ties or critiquing Trump. You know, I have concern about this big gap between our young men and young women. The young women are becoming more liberal. The young men are becoming more conservative. I think a lot of that has to do with the manosphere and the podcasters and all this that they're exposed to. I just saw a data point today that I think like 63% of young men are listening to those podcasts and things. And those aren't just like a 15-minute snippet. Those are like 3 hours of indoctrination. And so, yeah, I think that there are legitimate concerns there. But you're right, there have been some people. The coalition is crumbling around the edges for sure.
Yeah. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah.
Because people could be looked to say, well, look, even this guy, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
Could you elaborate just a little bit? I'm a grandmother. I don't have, you know, the same exposure.
Yes, ma'am.
You all do. What podcasts are you referring to?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that Joe Rogan is sort of the most famous one, but he is also pulled back, although Trump got him into the White House for the signing of the executive order on using like psychedelics for veterans. But I think he's trying to get back in Rogan's good graces. So Joe Rogan is a very popular one, and he really helped elevate Trump in 2024, particularly around young men. You have Nick Fuentes, who I think is objectively pretty abhorrent, anti-Semitic, racist, misogynist, you name it. Yes, ma'am. And so they're being told, you need to be more masculine, you need to be better looking, these are the only things that matter. Yes, you're being replaced, particularly white young men, you're being replaced, although Latino and African-American young men did shift a bit towards Trump as well.
Regarding Tucker, I'm hearing a lot of analysis that he's looking out for himself because he knows the ship is going down and he's trying to run for president. It's all self-serving. This has nothing to do with self-reflection. Anyway, that's what I'm hearing. Okay, go ahead.
I have a question about campaign strategies. I know you mentioned, especially for the Democrats in Missouri, like District 2, kind of lean more moderate would benefit them. Are there certain other strategies like phone banking versus deep canvassing that are going to work better in these races?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I have done phone banking a lot in past elections. I feel like it's not that effective anymore because who answers their phone if you don't know the phone number? Not me. And then I get bombarded with those text messages too, like, hey, it's Jenny from, and no, that's not effective for me either. And I think that's true for a lot of people. I've also done a lot of canvassing. I think if you can get people to answer their door, those one-on-one conversations are really powerful. That's a large part of how the marriage equality movement was successful. We also just saw in Hungary, and I hate to bring this up, but Orban obviously is a hero of Trump, had a lot of the same strategies. Our vice president went there to stump for him. But a big part of what they did was not just focus on the more urban areas. They really went out to the rural areas and engaged people. So maybe you have a community barbecue or some kind of an event, the school fundraising, things like this that bring people together that doesn't feel like politics to them, and then can engage and say, we're just trying to look to make our community better, to problem solve. You want to get involved and start to open the conversations like that. Based on what I've seen, seems to be more effective. You're welcome.
Money.
Yeah. And better memes. Yeah, better memes, better bumper stickers. That's fair.
So many things to worry about.
Yes, sir.
What about, anything in your past, which I appreciated how much there was there, about climate change? Because I think that is what should be the big issue. Democrats are more attuned to the reality. Republicans seem to be running away from any kind of understanding about how much danger there is and how much climate change is really real and getting worse. And people don't seem to understand why it is what it is. Why the science of climate change. Why is this happening?
Yeah.
Does that at all have a place to play in the Democratic Party?
It does, and I think particularly with young voters. So I work with young people every day. And of course, like everyone else, they're worried about the economy. They're worried about getting a job when they get out of school. They're worried about AI. But they definitely, climate change and gun violence, these are the kids who have grown up since Sandy Hook, who have had active shooter drills in their classroom, who know, folks who were shot at Central Visual Performing Arts, so gun violence is really important to them, and climate change. They're a generation that has come up knowing that they are going to be living with the effects of this, and their children are going to be living with the effects of this. So I definitely think that using that messaging to reach younger voters is important. It matters generally to Democrats, but it's lower on the list. But for younger voters, it's a higher priority. There's endless stuff to say, right?
You work with young people. Young people are going to save our lives.
That's my hope.
I'm curious, do they tend to shy away from the labels Democrat and Republican?
Yes, ma'am.
And is there a way that we can weave that into and not use the titles? So let's face it, some of our people aren't getting money from the Democratic National Party. So I don't want our young people not to be interested in voting for them because of the name.
Yeah.
I want them to vote for the candidate. So that's, you work with them. What's the best way to focus towards them?
Yeah, I think you're right. So young people are the most likely to identify as independents, the least likely to identify with the party. And if you think about it, if you're 18 years old, getting ready to vote for the first time, since you were, 7 years old, you've been living in the Trump era, this is all you know, is divisive, nasty politics. Why would you, I think they just want to shut down from all of that. They care about the issues. They care about climate change. The young women really care about reproductive rights. That's a big gap between the young men and women. But they do shy away from the labels. And part of it is that I think they think both parties are just, dysfunctional or not getting stuff done or whatever. And I think they also are worried about, well, if they think I'm a Democrat, they're going to think certain things about me, or we're going to be enemies if they're a Republican. And so one thing I have to work really hard in my classes is just getting them comfortable to even express their opinions, because they just see this divisiveness and are nervous to engage in it. And so I think that, again, creating welcoming spaces and talking about issues rather than party. And when they find a candidate who motivates them, whether it's someone in their 80s like Bernie Sanders, or it's someone like AOC or Cori Bush or whoever motivates them, they are willing to work for that and they're excited. But they want a candidate who they feel is authentic and who understands them and where they're coming from. And I mean, we all want that, but I think it's particularly important to the young voters right now.
But that's not how the power structure in Congress works, that the party that wins as the Speaker of the House and the Senate Majority Leader. And so you can't be independent all the time. You have to decide which party more closely represents your political philosophy and who you want controlling the Supreme Court.
So I think that, obviously that's true. We have a two-party system and that's how things get done. It doesn't mean I don't think that these young people lean towards Democrats or Republicans. I think they don't want to identify with that label. Do I think that these folks are basically voting for Democrats? So this is how I talk to them about it. You don't have to wear a blue shirt or a red shirt or a MAGA hat or say, but it's a shortcut. It's a heuristic. So I tell them, I give them both party platforms. Read through these positions and see which one you more closely align with. And that way, if you don't know the particular candidate or you have, some uncertainty, this is your shortcut. That this party generally believes in these things and this party generally believes in these things. And so that's the best way I've found to nudge them in one direction or the other, is to just letting them know what the parties themselves say that they stand for. And then which one resonates with you.
Anybody else? Any great questions here. I think we may have answered everything.
Wonderful. We have no more questions about politics. That's yes, we solved the problems.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me tonight. Thank you. Not sure how to turn this off. I didn't repeat the questions back. I just wanted
Oh, it worked.
Thank you again, Dr. Anita, for coming. That was super informative, and also it's just always nice to have somebody that's local, that's kind of, you have the national scope, but then you can also kind of talk to the local vibes that are going on. And it brings us, it brings me hope. And just with the common with the young people and stuff too. I don't consider myself very young anymore. I'm 32 and I'm about to have 4 kids, so I'm not like one of the cool youngins anymore. But when I'm talking, especially to liberal moms on the playground, I get the
the most important thing we can do is not shy away from calling ourselves Democrats. Being like, yeah, I'm gonna be a Democrat. I'm a Democrat. I'm proud of it. I'm fun. You know, I think I'm kind of cool. Probably that, but I think Democrats tend to take themselves seriously, at least in the national conversation, and we just gotta kind of be, we gotta be ourselves and just make it fun again to be a Democrat. I was in high school when Obama got elected the first time, and it was cool, like Obama was cool, Obama was fun, and so the Democratic Party was cool and fun. And we can't change maybe the national narrative, but we can say here in Chesterfield, here in Manchester, and Wildwood, Democrats are cool. We pay off student lunch then. You know what I'm saying? So thank you so much for coming, and we will see you next month at our candidate forum. Oh, do you have a question?
I forgot to mention when I was talking, I want to wish good health to Dr. Nick.
Yes. Have a good night.
Input to he's not a hot boy. He says what's on his mind. He questions. And so you have to have this space that you can and he thinks it on and like so it's